Hi, I'm Jason Odell, and today I want to talk to you about teleconverters, which is a very hot topic amongst photographers, especially photographers who are trying to capture wildlife images. And what a teleconverter does essentially is magnifies the lens. It's an extra element that you can attach to your lens, and it magnifies the image. And teleconverters come in all shapes and sizes, different magnifications. I've got the three Nikon ones here. This is a TC14. This is a 1.4x converter, so it multiplies your focal length by a factor of 1.4. This is their middle of the line, or middle of the range, I should say, TC17, which is a 1.7 multiplier. And this is the TC20E3, which is a 2x multiplier. So this will double your focal length. So a lot of people see teleconverters. They are the Nikon ones or the Canon ones. They're not inexpensive by themselves, but they're certainly a lot cheaper than, say, going out and buying a 600mm lens. And so a typical question would be, well, if I have something like this 70 to 300mm lens, why not just attach a 2x converter onto it and turn this into a 600mm lens? Well, there's a couple of issues that you're going to have. The first issue is compatibility. With the Nikon teleconverters specifically, the mount in the converter is actually slightly different. It's got a little notch here in the F mount. And what that means is that it will not physically mount to lenses that Nikon has produced that do not support a teleconverter. So even though this 70 to 300mm Nikon AFS lens has an F mount, this mount is physically incompatible with the teleconverter. Now, why is Nikon doing that? Why not just make it mount to all of their lenses? Well, a couple of reasons. First reason is you can probably see here that the lens element of the teleconverter on the Nikon teleconverters, it protrudes slightly from the base of the mount. Now, depending on the lens that you have, the rear element of the lens may contact the front element of the teleconverter. Now, if that happens, you're asking for trouble because you're going to have the two elements brush up against each other. They could be damaged. Take, for example, this lens here, which is the 24 to 70 f2.8. There's no way to attach a teleconverter on here because this rear element of the lens is actually flush right here. There's no place to physically make these mount. So that's one problem. And you can get around that problem in some respects by using a teleconverter from a third party. So a Sigma, a Tamron, or a Kenko teleconverter may not have this protruding front element, and it may actually mount onto your lens. Well, then why not just do that? Why doesn't Nikon, for example, build their teleconverters to mount with these other lenses? When you add a teleconverter, any of these, to any lens, you're going to lose one or more f-stops of effective aperture. When I add a 1.4x converter, I take whatever the minimum aperture is of this lens, or I should say the maximum aperture, the minimum f number, which in this case ranges from 4.5 to 5.6, and I add a stop of light to that. I decrease the light by one stop. So this 5.6 lens, if I'm zoomed out here to 300mm, turns into an f8 lens. And that causes two problems. One is that the image starts to look dark in your viewfinder. The other problem is that autofocus performance degrades significantly. In fact, with most Nikon bodies, Nikon only guarantees effective autofocus performance at apertures through f5.6. Now, the one exception to this is the new Nikon D4 SLR, which is as of yet not out, and it claims to allow autofocus performance with some of the AF sensors through f8, depending on what you do. But most of the time, what you're going to find is that even if you try to use autofocus, the amount of light that gets through on one of these slower lenses is so dim that your autofocus is going to hunt. Even if it does operate, it's not going to lock quickly or accurately. So what you want to do then is use is use a combination of teleconverter and lens that is ideal for both autofocus operation and compatibility. So here, for example, is a lens that is designed to take a teleconverter, and there's a little notch here, a little tab in Nikon's F-mount, which means it is compatible with any of these three converters. So with this lens, because it's a constant f2.8 aperture, I'm going to get a loss of 1 stop with my 1.4 converter, a loss of 1.5 stops with my 1.7x converter, and 2 stops with my 2x converter. So I can use this 1.4x converter and get an f4 lens, or if I double this aperture, f2.8, with my 2x converter, it's an f5.6 lens. All of those apertures are guaranteed to work with my Nikon autofocus system. And then there's one last reason why you shouldn't just jump out and try to put a teleconverter on any old lens, and that's image quality. When you use a teleconverter, you're magnifying everything in the image, including imperfections in the optical design of your lens. So images that might be a little bit soft, wide open, with your lens, or might have a little chromatic aberration, those kinds of defects, they're going to be more readily apparent when you use a teleconverter. And so typically, if you get good performance with your lens, stop down a stop or two. So say best, sharpest performance with this lens might be at f4. Okay. If I add my 1.4x converter, wide open is now f4, I need to stop down to f5.6 to get the sharpest performance. And you can see with this light trade-off, you're going to run into some problems where you might need to shoot for optimal sharpness. You might end up with an effective aperture of something like f11 with a slow lens. And that doesn't always translate to ideal conditions in the field, because you'll find yourself not being able to get the necessary shutter speeds to freeze action of your subjects. That would be without cranking up the ISO to possibly ridiculous levels, and then you're running into the trade-off of things like noise in your image. So what I recommend for teleconverters is always put a teleconverter on a good lens. So even though you might view it as a budget solution to get longer focal length, if you try to mount a teleconverter onto a low-end lens, you're probably going to be disappointed one way or another. Either the image quality won't be good enough for you, you're going to have to stop down much too far to get any kind of usable shutter speed, sharpness trade-off, or your autofocus won't work. So that's my take on teleconverters. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.